Hello, everybody. I'm Andy Papastefano, CEO and founder of Telenos Cybersecurity. We're a managed security service provider that provides SOC and third-party risk management services to customers in the mid-market. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about how we can use CRQ to drive real change. Just to kick off, however, I just wanted to point out that this is not a presentation about how to actually perform cyber risk quantification. There are tons of really good materials out there that I would recommend. Within Telenos, we use FAIR, everything from FAIR Institute, which is around quantifying risk and sort of framing that in business-friendly language. There's also this really great book from Richard Searson, who is the Chief Risk Officer of Qualys, How to Measure Anything in Cybersecurity Risk. There's a couple of nice insights on storytelling within his book as well, which I brought through in today's presentation. But yes, essentially, the whole scientific process of quantifying risk, turning it into a set of numbers, the formal process behind that, we're assuming that you've done that. This isn't about Monte Carlo simulations. This isn't about risk matrices, which actually Qualys CRO advises against in terms of presenting stories back to the board. But, we're assuming up until this point that you've done all of that scientific work to get to a set of quantified risks that you now want to present to the business. But before I get into, how we frame it, I have a bit of a confession to make. Having run multiple risk assessments in various different parts of the business, these are particular stories where I think we've not done great as a business, where although the quantification exercise was really good at predicting what risks were really relevant to the business, they were largely ignored or mistrusted, and in some cases, too late. And so putting this presentation together, I asked the question, maybe we actually suck. And if we suck at cyber risk quantification, what is the problem here? What is the real issue with the way that we've followed this process? And the realization that we came to was actually the problem is not in the numbers. If you want to really affect change, it's the way that you frame these numbers and the way that you frame these risks to the stakeholders that you're presenting to that really moves them. Ultimately, you need some action to be taken off the back of the work that you've done. A lot of work goes into quantifying risks. There's tons of data that sits underneath this process that you've got to trawl through. And really, from an analyst perspective, if you're stuck in that, it's quite difficult to step out and see what the real story is. So anyway, let's get into some of the particular issues and the lessons learned. What I want to stress through this process is actually the way that our risk analysis process or risk quantification works within Telenos. We've got multiple streams of work. And so actually risks get surfaced through different parts of our services that we provide. So in the first example story, our SOC, who performs these regular service reviews where we're looking at a lot of the SOC data and talking to customers about what it is that we're seeing on the efficacy of the controls in their environment, those risks were surfaced through that service pillar, for example. In the second story, which was a financial services company that lost a whole lot of data, we performed a maturity assessment on their cybersecurity, which was using NIST cybersecurity framework. And we built a whole lot of threat models and stories that were presented to the stakeholder. But because there was just, again, so much data and so much complexity, He didn't trust what it was that we were telling him. And then finally, the third sort of service pillar was through our third-party risk management assessments, where we were looking across a supplier base. We identified a particular risk in a supplier that turned out to be the weak link in a chain that had caused ransomware for a manufacturer. And so diving into each of these, the sources are different, the process is the same, and there were different issues that sort of surfaced when we dug into these. So starting with the ESG consultancy, um, a point I want to make about the SOC being really well placed to surface risk. It's got access to so much data, which is a really important part of the cyber risk quantification process. We're seeing real-time attacks. We're seeing the configuration of controls, what controls are working, what aren't controls. So really good place to report on the efficacy of controls in the organization and what threat actors are actually touching, or prodding and poking. And in this case, the socket identified, with nearly 100% coverage, the one place that wasn't being covered by the SOC that didn't have visibility was the public website. And this particular ESG consultancy took a look at the risk that we were raising, that we weren't plugged into this website, that we were seeing third parties not having good controls in the management of this website. Threat actors were poking and prodding it the whole time. We were presenting this risk to the IT department as part of the service reviews, and their response was just, it's marketing's problem. They've gone out and they've found an outsourced website provider. It's hosted externally. It's not connected with our systems at all. It's just complete brochureware. If it gets hacked, so be it. And all of our quantification was saying, actually, no, it's bubbled up to become a really big risk for the business. So fast forward, a couple of months later, we're responding to a particular incident where the entire business's corporate emails stopped flowing. So emails being sent out from the consultancy were not arriving in customers' mailboxes, and actually sales team were in the middle of a RFP process where they were responding to an RFP, really big piece of business, and those mails weren't getting out, and subsequently they lost that opportunity. So they didn't respond in time to the RFP process. That even though that they thought they were getting the stuff in on time, they were disqualified from the process and they lost that revenue. And being a big player in the market, it also hugely damaged their reputation. So why am I telling this story about corporate emails and the risk that we raised about the website? Well, in the incident response, we tracked the issue back to the website. A threat actor had managed to breach the website, which again, marketing's problem, it was brochureware, and they'd inserted a little piece of code on the website that anyone who wasn't from a Russian IP address, make of that what you will, that when they go to the consultancy's website, it was going to inject a little piece of code that redirects them to some malware. Now, how this linked back to the emails was the consultancy had an email signature where in every email signature, it had a link to the corporate website. Now, as they were sending out these emails, big email service security protection providers like Mimecast, for instance, they were getting these emails and they were scanning them and going through all of the links. And because it was then jumping to the corporate website as a link and scanning that page and finding this malware sitting on it, it logged that particular email as being malicious. And with enough volume of these malicious emails coming through from the corporate domain, they blacklisted the domain. And because blacklists are sort of these global compromise lists that all email security providers share with each other, suddenly the entire corporate domain had been blacklisted and nobody could send emails. So this was an example of where, a story that nobody could consider, nobody could predict, but the risk quantification was saying, this is, if you're likely to get breached or likely to have an issue, this is where it's going to happen. They didn't act on it, and it made us think, what could we have done before the breach to have affected the change that we wanted to see? Interestingly, after the incident response, they rushed to implement all of the recommendations that we'd submitted and they'd been sitting on for months, but it was already too late and the deal had been lost. And so, the lesson here for me, at least, was, the SOC did everything that it was supposed to do, and it raised the risk, and the risk was a good one. It turned out to be an area of weakness that eventually got that domain compromised. But we were talking to the wrong people. And it was just really important here that we framed the story in the right way, that it went to the correct stakeholders. And you almost have to do some of IT's job for them on why this is an important thing for marketing to take seriously. And that's something that we could have done better there. Another story. I've talked about the financial services company that we performed a maturity assessment for. This particular exec was struggling to quantify the cyber risk for his board, and he brought us in to do it. And so off the back of looking at all of the controls, we use the NIST cybersecurity assessment to make sure we're looking at all of those controls with a bit of a scientific measurement rather than a qualitative assessment on the maturity, a bit of a quantitative assessment on security controls. We came up with these 3 really detailed threat models, which, if you're using fair terminology, are loss event scenarios, which basically go through all the detail of explaining a story in the context that the business, understands. These are the things that could happen to you, and the reason why they're the highest rated risks. It was a hugely scientific exercise, loads of data, and we provided all of this up in the final assessment and the report. And after looking at all of this, the exec turned around and disagreed with the assessment. He's like, I've got a quote there up. If he has to present this to his board, it just looks like the cyber nerds got together and had a field day. There was just too much data. The remediation program that we came up with just seemed too expensive. And because they're quite an agile business with lots of technology, they had other priorities. And so the first reaction to this report was, I don't trust it. And I don't think the board is going to trust it either. Interestingly, 4 days after we presented this report, the most significant of those loss events that we presented actually occurred. Almost, as if I had the crystal ball and I looked into it, it happened almost exactly the way that we said it was going to play out. And because, we'd recently interacted, he called us for incident response. And they're now a SOC customer, interestingly. It was through that incident that we'd won the trust. But again, reflecting on this, if they hadn't been breached, how could I have told the story so that it was more relevant and more digestible? And, what didn't come through was the urgency, the why now aspect. All of these things probably important, but why now? What's going to drive that action? And how am I going to help that exec to deliver the message to his board? Because if it isn't framed in the right sense and that urgency isn't there, there's going to be no action, and then it's just numbers for the sake of numbers, or as we've got on the slide there, it's just paperwork. Our final story is for a manufacturing customer that we're running a third-party risk management program for. So essentially, they've outsourced this to us. Now, before they outsourced this to us, we'd been talking for 6 months to get this off the ground. They've got thousands of suppliers and essentially weren't doing any kind of assessment, any kind of due diligence. Basically, the business was just going out and buying services from suppliers left, right, and center, and they'd accumulated this list of thousands of suppliers. And although the IT team understood the importance of this, they just couldn't convince their business and pull the trigger. And then they, in our sales process, went very quiet. Uh, we couldn't figure out why, after we were getting so much traction, they'd gone so quiet. And it turned out that they'd been hit by ransomware, which had brought their business offline for nearly 2 weeks. Now, in a manufacturing business, that's a huge loss. Machines stopped working. They had to turn machines off. They had to discontinue some machines. And yeah, huge impact from a reputation perspective, loss of revenue. And of course, data was stolen, and part of the ransomware operation was then also to blackmail with the data that had been stolen. So a massive issue for this particular manufacturer. And when the dust settled, that's when they brought us back and they said, yes, business have prioritized the third-party risk program now. And it turned out that their ransomware had been identified as originating from a supplier, but they didn't know which one. And as we rolled up our sleeves and got into it, there was one that stood out like a beacon in terms of the deficient controls. And we highlighted that, and we, again, through CRQ, what the risk was, quantified why we picked this particular supplier, and armed with that information, looked at it forensically, discovered actually it did occur from this particular supplier. They were the correct supplier. We'd identified the correct supplier that the ransomware had originated from. Or at least, sorry, the vector that they'd used to get into the organization. So CRQ worked. Again, in all three instances, we'd followed the process and we'd identified the thing that actually did come true. But in this case, it was too late, and we couldn't motivate it in time to, if they'd had this in place 6 months before, perhaps we would have identified this risky supply and they could have avoided the ransomware incident. Doing it as sort of an exercise, almost an academic exercise outside of supplier onboarding or ongoing supplier management, is a bit academic, or it's pointless, really. So how do we embed CRQ into the operational processes and get closer to where the decision is being made? Because that's the whole purpose, right? Get closer to the budgeting cycle so that you know what you're buying, or get closer to the supplier decision, get closer to the controls assessment, basically bring these things much closer to where the decision's being made. So yes, just summarizing that, the issues across the three stories: CRQ worked but wasn't effective, and the problem was really how we were telling the story and the human processes that sat around the very scientific quantification process. IT were reframing for the business without their involvement. CRQ is a complex and time-consuming process, but actually by almost showing it off and saying, well, look at this big process we've been through to come to this number, you must trust it. That complexity creates mistrust, and of course wasn't able to really demonstrate any urgency. And then, of course, if you're not embedding those things operationally, it's a bit pointless. It's an academic exercise. One thing I do want to say, having done some research on effective storytelling, there's a few key things that you can do to become a better storyteller, to really elevate those numbers out of just being an academic exercise into something that's going to drive change. Be clear, use very plain language, and, don't talk Monte Carlo simulations. Because if you have to go into explaining the process, you're going to lose people. Just make the thing that you want to achieve really obvious. Be relevant, frame it in business-specific language and terminology, but also importantly, tailor it for different audiences. Know that the stakeholder that you're talking to is going to have to also present the story to other stakeholders. And so you're going to have to prepare different viewpoints. And I'm going to come back to that just now, actually, in terms of having the same story, but different versions of it. Be timely. Again, this is about operationalizing processes to make sure that the information is available before the decision's made and not after. So really understanding the flow around, or at least the business processes around the decision point, I think is a really crucial part of CRQ. And it's part of the data that needs to come into the model and also part of the story. Something from Richard at Qualis, no drama. Boards hate drama and surprises. So something that I could have done on my NIST cybersecurity assessment is certainly socialize aspects of it before the meeting, get the decision before the meeting, so that basically the meeting itself is just a formal approval point, but everybody's already on side. They already understand the detail from their perspective, and so that nobody's surprised. Another really useful tip is you don't know which stakeholders you're going to be talking to on which days, and also the mood that they're going to be in. So they might be deeply interested in the risk that you're trying to raise, and you must be prepared to have your 30-minute conversation, which will then include all of the detail of how you've arrived at it. And a lot of the CRQ numeric stuff sits in that, the how and the why that you've arrived at this, and prioritize it in the way that you have. Or you might be given 90 seconds. You're bumping into someone and you've got to really very quickly explain what that risk is. And I think by having different versions, not only for different stakeholders, but also different timings, from a 90-second all the way through to a 30-minute conversation, it lets you really distill the core of the message that you're trying to get across. And it's just a thinking exercise that lets you understand whether your narrative or your story is going to be effective or not. If you can't tell that same story in 90 seconds, then it's too complicated and you need to simplify it somehow. So it's just a really good practice for refining your stories, and prepare for these. Prepare to have the different conversations, write them out. To wrap up, the three disciplines, and driven largely from the lessons of delivering this in real life, your numbers need to be wrapped up in a story, and as per my previous slide, have different versions of the stories for different stakeholders. Prepare well. Drop the complexity. CRQ itself can be very complicated. I mean, it is a science, and there's lots of material on that, lots of experience that comes into getting it right, but you're not delivering that as part of the risk story. Focus on urgency. Why now? If you can't motivate why this particular risk needs to be addressed now, I think you're missing a key part of the story. And if there isn't that urgency, people are going to thank you for the hard work you've done. They're going to log it somewhere, and then they're not going to come back to it. And as we've seen in my stories, if you leave it too long, it eventually becomes true. And then, what was the point? Finally, get closer to the decision-making processes. So embed your storytelling ability into the various processes where it makes sense. So I've got there a couple of examples: contract renewals, onboarding of suppliers or customers or staff, budgeting processes, project planning, business strategy. How is CRQ operationalized to the point where these stories are constantly being fed into the business at the right times, so that they've got that information to make the decisions. With that, I think I'd be happy to take a couple of questions. I hope you've enjoyed the presentation.